Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Cheryl Jennison DeProza, and today I'm joined by colleague Katie Farine, and she's going to talk us through Designer 4.2 workflows. But before we get into that, just a few items of housekeeping. First of all, due to the current pandemic, we are not coming to you from our usual controlled environments. We are broadcasting to you from our homes. I just bring this up because I want you to know if we run into any sort of audio issues or technical difficulties, just bear with us. We'll do our best to get through those if they do arise, but just want to make sure you're aware of that. Second of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. Usually takes us about a week or so to get the audio and video edited, so it's up to our standards. But once it is ready, it will be viewable at shure.com/webinars. And you can go there for all of our other upcoming webinars and to see all of our past archived webinars. So that's shure.com/webinars. We'll also be sending up a follow-up email once it's available with a link to the video there as well. And then lastly, as we go through the session today, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the question pane. If you're not sure where to find the question pane, just sort of look for a question mark a circle with a question mark in it and click on that. Or if you are using the GoToWebinar desktop app, look for a dark gray toolbar with an orange box with a white arrow on it. Click on that orange box and you will be able to access the question section. Ask any questions that you do have, but please note that we will be holding on those until the end of the session. All right, that wraps up all the housekeeping. Let's get into the workflows. Take it away, Katie.
All right, thanks, Cheryl. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Farine. I'm a product specialist, and I work on the designer team at Shure. So today we're going to be focusing on Designer version 4.2, which came out this summer, a couple months ago. If you attended the last webinar for Designer, I believe it was a version 4.1. So since then, we've had some cool new features and device support. So mainly the difference between version 4.1 and 4.2 are a few software features. The first is called Optimize, which we'll go through to show how you can quickly set up a Shure system of mics, processors, and speakers. We'll also look at the firmware updating feature as well, which is now available within Designer to update devices on the same subnet and cross subnet. We'll also look at some changes we made to the presets feature. As well as we'll look at the new device support, and including the 710 linear array microphone, the MXA Network Mute Button, and the MXN networked loudspeaker. All right, so getting into it, I'm actually going straight into Designer. All right, so this is what you see when you open Designer and you have no projects created and maybe you've never used it before. First, let's look over the basic software architecture. Your default page is called My Projects, and this is where you can create different projects for perhaps different end users you work with, or if you're an end user yourself, you can separate your work into different floors, for example, or in different rooms. Next up on the left is My Templates. This is where you can create a room template that you can then reuse over and over. For example, if you have a standard room type and you want to be able to create copies of that, you can do that here. Next up is Online Devices. This is where you can quickly and easily access your discovered devices on your network. In this case, I'm discovering 4 devices, and I'm sitting here at home with these 4 devices on my network, and I can quickly get into any one of these to configure them. Next up is the Event Log. This is where you can see system events, such as when devices have come on and offline, when you've done certain actions in Designer, such as created routes or optimized the system and things like that. And lastly, in this main navigation, there's a settings page. This is where, importantly, you can select your NIC for discovering devices. You can turn on if you want automatic firmware downloads, since now firmware updating is a feature of Designer. And a few other things like selecting the event log history maximum time, sending anonymous analytics to Shure, and seeing your version. So now we're going to focus on going through some core workflows in Designer, first starting with creating a design when you're completely off the network. So to start out, I'm going to create a new project called Shure Project. And this will basically take me to locations. Locations in Designer are under the project. So there's project, and within the project, you can have locations and folders. A lot of times we see users using this as projects are maybe different clients or locations throughout the world, and then locations are typically rooms. So let's create a new location called Room 101. And this will pop open a new window, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. And bear with me because sometimes when I'm sharing my screen, some actions are a little slower. Okay, so there are two modes within the location. You can either be in live mode, discovering devices on your network, or you can be in this design mode where you're completely off the network working with virtual devices. So because I'm already on my network and I'm already discovering those 4 devices I showed you, it was straight in live mode when I came in here. But for this first scenario, we're going to focus on what it would look like to design offline and then basically push those settings to my system on the network. So let's start dropped out of live mode and start with virtual devices. So when you're on the screen, it says drag and drop a device here to add. So I'm going to do just that. And I'm going to put in some devices that are actually in my system again. So for example, the MXA710, this will prompt me to select a device installation. With the MXA710, we have certain lobe defaults that we apply with different installations within the room. So I'll show you that when we go over to the coverage map, but just for this case, I'll select wall horizontal. And I will just position the device block on this page. For my processor, I'm going to add a P300. Okay. And I'm also going to add a loudspeaker as well. Another new device that we have is this MXN networked loudspeaker. So now we have, our full audio system of Shure devices, from mics to processors to loudspeakers. So you may have noticed once I added at least a microphone and a processor, this optimize button started blinking. Optimize is a new feature of 4.2, and it does a lot at once in one button. So what this is going to do is create Shure's recommended audio routes for my system based on those devices that I had just added. It will also turn on mute sync for the whole system when applicable. And it will adjust several audio settings such as gains and EQs and know where to best apply DSP based on what devices I have in my system. You can click this button to see a full list of that, but I won't open it for now. It's a really long list of things that we changed with Optimize. So now going to Optimize, and you can see it made those routes really quickly. And now it says close to make manual adjustments or continue to coverage to complete the room configuration. So an important note is that Optimize doesn't touch coverage at this point. So right now, all it did was those, the routes, the EQs and gains and mute sync, like I said, but you still would need to go to coverage if you want to visualize or tweak anything about the coverage. But since we use the 710 and selected a covered installation, actually a lot of that work is already done, unless you want to just leave it as is, which is very possible too. So now you can see that we've created the audio routes that we recommend based on these 3 devices, and even routed the reference back into the microphone and routed the processor to the speaker as well. Something important to note about the routing in Optimize is that if I have multiple IntelliMix microphones, such as if I had 2 or 3 MXA 710s in this case, it would take the auto mix out of each microphone to the processor. So basically, Optimize looks at how many channels are available on the processor and will choose whether or not to take direct outs versus auto mix outs of the microphones. In this case, it took direct outs because it did have those 4 individual channels available on the P300. From here, you can still make manual changes. As always with Designer, you can delete a route or manually add one. Again, this is all customizable, but with Optimize, it gets it done based off what devices are in your system. Moving on to the coverage map tab, this is where you can import a floor plan image and visualize your microphones and speakers over a floor plan image. So in this case, we're showing again our new devices that apply to the coverage map, which are the 710 here, and then the MXN loudspeaker. When you have a lot of devices in your system, this could get a little crowded, so we do have layers on the left panel here. If you want to show and hide the device coverage, you can still see the icon to visualize where it is in the room over a floor plan. But again, if you want to focus on configuring one device's coverage, if you need to, you can do that via layers. And just for people who may not know and may have not used the floor plan feature before, as always, Designer has an add image feature where you can import a floor plan. For example, I'm going to import this JPEG and scale it appropriately. To do so, you draw a line to set the image scale. So you can draw a line to this doorway, for example, if I know that this is 3 feet wide. I just set that reference, and now everything's to scale in my room. And there are other settings, such as if your drawing already has the grid on it, you can hide the grid in Designer and things like this. And then you can start placing your devices within the room and visualizing your coverage from here. Additionally, I should note for the 710, although this training is mainly focused on designer flows and not individual devices as much, you can still change the position of the MXA 710. So again, with those 4 defaults, you get default load configurations based on what you've selected. All right. So let's say that I've configured everything and it's as I want this design, and now I'm on the network and I want to get all of these settings that I've done off the network onto my actual physical devices. To do this, you could either go straight to the sync tab over here in the location, or you could click the live mode button and it will direct you over to sync. So I'm just going to click that. So now I'm in live mode and it says drag and drop a device here to add or onto a device below to associate. In this case, I want to associate my devices so that I can get that design that I did offline to these actual physical devices. When you go over to your online devices on the left, you can identify your devices by hovering over the icon and then click it, and you'll see that the light, in front of you is actually blinking. Then you can drag it over and just drop it on top of this chip where the device name is, and this will make that association between the virtual device and the online device. So again, I'm going to do that for all of my devices in this design. Okay, so now that all 3 devices are associated, the synchronize button became enabled. From this point, you can either push your virtual design to your online devices, or you can pull to design. What pull means is just the vice versa. It's pulling your current settings that are on the network devices to a design, perhaps if you want to save a backup before you overwrite the settings or anything like that. In this case, I'm going to push, and this may take a moment here because it is pushing a lot of settings on each device. And this is basically overwriting the actual online devices with everything that I did offline. There are a couple things that you can't set offline, such as network settings. Of course, static things like MAC address and serial number, but everything else will be pushing at this point. Okay, so I think during a screen share, it's going a little slower than usual. Typically, this should only take about 30 seconds max. But basically, after this point, you're in live mode and any changes are made in real time. There we go. Okay, successful push, everything's done, and everything is synced. Now it encourages you to save a design as a preset before making any further changes. We'll get into presets flow in a little bit because that is a little different in 4.2. Okay, so as mentioned, again, I'm in live mode now. I've pushed my design. Everything's in real time. So if I make any changes to routes or coverage, this will be made in real time, just like the browser interfaces for our devices. Same thing if I remove a couple routes here. If I were to go into Dante Controller, I would see those removed in real time. Or if I added the routes in Dante Controller, same thing applies. You would see those routes drawn in real time in Designer. All right, so another workflow is creating templates. I just want to show the quick difference between what a template and a location are. So you can always create a template here. For example, if you like how you configured this room and you want to save it off as a template that you want to reuse over and over, you can click Create Template here. Or you can also go back to this main home page, My Templates, and create a new one here. So for example, if I have a room type that I want to create, you'll see that it will look very similar to the location that we were just in. Really, the only difference is that a template is only made with virtual devices when you're off the network. And then basically from this point, you can create a location from a template, which is essentially the same thing as copying it and being able to reuse it over and over. Okay, so for the next scenario, we're going to cover just getting straight into a room with online devices. Let's say you never did a design and you're just on the network and you want to configure the room as quick as possible. So I'm going to remove all of these online devices from my location and just create a new example location. Again, within my Shure project. Let's call it room 102. Okay, so again, because I'm already plugged into my network, it will go straight into live mode in this case. And it's really as simple as that. If you don't have a design offline, you can just go straight into live mode and add your online devices to your room and start configuring them from here. And that's really all there is to it. I should mention too that once you add devices, and apologies again, it's a little slow with screen share. I should mention too, with virtual devices or online devices, anywhere from Designer, you can configure these devices to get more into advanced settings that we haven't seen at the location yet. If you're familiar with the browser interfaces, it will look very similar to that. So you can do that by selecting a device and clicking configure, or by just double clicking the device from anywhere within Designer, really. So now you can see I double clicked that MXA 710 and it pulled up the channel strips for the 710, IntelliMix settings, and more advanced settings like LED settings and all this kind of stuff. And now the device windows are overlaying over the location. So if you saw that, it didn't pop open a new window. You can still pop open the window if you want to, for example, compare multiple devices in different windows. And there's this pop out button here to do that. Or you can just click the X and that will basically take you back to the location that you were just in. If you don't want to create a location and you're very used to the browser interfaces and you just want to get straight into a device, I would say the best way to do that is to just go straight to the online devices list. And from here, again, you can double click a device and get straight into its configuration. However, there are some things that require you to create a location, such as now coverage for many devices is actually in that location coverage map tab, as well as some other settings. But for many of these channel strip settings and more advanced device configuration settings, you can get to those straight from online devices. Okay, so actually now that we're on the online devices list, it's worth pointing out the firmware updating feature, which is new as of 4.2. So if you go to online devices, you'll basically see that you have an available firmware column here. I do have all the latest firmware packages downloaded to my PC already, but if I had not, there would be a notification here, a little button next to the online devices button that says new downloads available. And then you can download the latest firmware packages from Shure.com, and then they're available to you to use within Designer. So after those download, the default will be to go to the latest, but you can select an older version if you want. For example, I could select 316 on this MXA 310. And there is an indication as well with this dot next to the firmware version about the update status. So in this case, yellow means update available, and green is latest firmware. There's also a third state you can be in where it's a red dot and it's just completely unsupported firmware. To actually push the firmware updates to the devices after you've selected your target available firmware, you simply check off a device and update the firmware from here. It's also worth noting that in general, you can add cross-subnet devices in Designer. So not just for firmware updating, but for any device control. Once you add cross-subnet devices and they're being discovered, you can control them just like same subnet devices. So I don't have any devices cross-subnet that I can show this for, but to do this, you add devices by their IP address. You can either copy and paste a list here or import a file. And then once you add those devices, you want to tell Designer which IP addresses to look for. So you do have to set this IP scope, is what it's called. And you can select which project you had added those IPs under, and that will tell Designer which IP addresses to look for, basically. And then it will discover those cross-subnet devices like any other here. For the firmware updating feature, one note too is that the only supported device in Designer that is not updatable from 4.2 is the IntelliMix Room. So just note everything else supported by Designer 4.2 is firmware updatable, with the exception of IntelliMix Room. But with IntelliMix Room's recent update, you can actually update from the computer itself as well. Okay, so let's see, going into the next feature, I wanted to talk about sharing project files a little bit. One important thing to note is that Shure devices don't know anything about a Designer location. So if a second technician or person comes in with their own instance of Designer on their computer, they won't know about those locations unless you've specifically shared your project file with them. Project files, importantly, are only virtual device information. So let's say you go on the network. Let's actually open a room to show an example. You're on the network and you're tweaking settings, and you want to get those latest settings to your colleague, for example. To do this, basically, you want to go through that pull action that I was talking about. So say I tweak some settings on my 710. Now I want to go to the sync tab and actually pull to design. Again, because an exported project file only knows about virtual devices. It doesn't know which online devices are associated with each location, if that makes sense. So make sure that if you want to get the latest info from the network to other colleagues with Designer, first pull to design, and then go over to the project list and export the project file here. All right, lastly, I wanted to show some preset features and changes in 4.2. So if I go into online devices and click a device such as, well, there we go, the 710. This flag icon up here is basically now going to have preset control for each online device. This is very similar to the browser interface, so you can save, import, export, and clear up to 10 preset slots on each device. But please note that this only applies to online devices, and you actually don't have this capability for virtual devices in 4.2. So this is very similar to the browser interface workflow, and you could a preset file that you had exported from a browser interface, you could bring it into Designer, or vice versa. But again, it only applies to online devices in this case. And again, you get to that by double-clicking a device and going to this preset flag up here. Okay, so I think we went through optimize, firmware updating, preset changes, and showed some of the workflows of the new devices, such as the linear array and the networked loudspeaker. And I think that's about it. Are there any questions on these workflows? Anything we want to go through again?
Sorry, had to unmute there. Yes, we've got quite a few questions. So I think you might have answered some of these, but we'll go through them anyway, just to reiterate. First question, does the firmware update tool within Designer only update products supported by Designer, i.e. it won't update Axient digital products?
Correct. You would still have to go to the Shure Update utility software to update those. And I should note too that Shure Update utility still supports these devices as well. This is just in addition to that. But yeah, Designer will only update what it supports, again, with the exception of IntelliMix Room in this version.
Okay. Is the hardware acquisition on the network made with MDNS?
So I can talk a little bit about that, but I'm not as technical, to be honest. We discover devices based on, so same subnet device discovery is done using multicast, and we use a protocol called ACN to do that. All of the ports and documentation about that are available in our Designer user guide, and you can find out more about that via our website. I should note too, for everything else past same subnet discovery, everything else is unicast. So for example, discovering cross subnet devices, controlling cross subnet devices, and even controlling same subnet devices. I hope that helps, but we definitely do have more information on how we discover stuff and what ports are required to be open on our website.
Great. Can the app be audited by system on?
I'm not sure what you mean by audited, but in this case, there is no connection between Designer and Systemon's databases. So if you create a bunch of locations in Designer, unfortunately, you are going to have to go create those in Systemon again. But we definitely hear if you're requesting any sort of connection between those two. And for anyone who doesn't know, Systemon is a server application, unlike Designer, which is a desktop application. And basically in Systemon, once you create that whole database of your rooms, everyone's accessing that same server, and you don't have to share between users because it just has one database and all different users are accessing that same Systemon server.
Great. Okay. If the P300 is being used to echo cancel individual mic channels, what is the benefit of routing the AEC reference to the MXA710?
So again, I think that's a bit more into some DSP settings that I can't answer as clearly. I'm sorry about that, but it is just generally recommended to do that. And I think we could get back to you with more details.
And this is a good point to say that if we have any questions, if you have any questions that we are unable to answer here or anything that you have to ask about any other sort of audio topic, you can open up a ticket with our support team at shure.com/contact. That's shure.com/contact. You can open up a ticket with them. We've got a great team of guys and gals that can answer a lot of questions, and they can certainly dive into all of these products with great detail. That's what we pay them the big bucks for. All right. Next question. I'm not sure when this one came in. But they say, can we create our own floor plan here? So maybe talk about where floor plans can be created within Designer and potentially where they cannot.
Sure. Yeah. So in that location coverage map view, that's where I showed adding the image with the floor plan. If you're asking if you can add generic objects, if you don't have an actual image, at this moment you can't. You can kind of resize this workspace, which is this white square area here. If you want to basically kind of mimic the room size with these handles, you can do that. But there is no way to add generic shapes if you don't have a floor plan.
Great. Okay, so we have a couple of responses to that question from some knowledgeable people here. A few notes. AEC reference helps the MXA710 with autofocus. Yeah, and it helps the microphone know the difference between a person talking and a voice coming through the speaker. So thanks to everybody who chimed in with an answer on that. We've got a lot of great, knowledgeable people listening in, so thank you. All right, next question. Are the Dante routes made when optimized function is used? If so, if I make manual adjustments after optimize, say to include some MXW channels for inputs 1 to 4, are the Dante channels automatically routed when I manually connect the MXA710 to the P300 inputs 5 through 8? There was a lot to that question.
Yeah, I'll try to answer it, and if I don't, just let me know. Yeah, optimize will automatically overwrite all the routes. So after you've optimized, the best way to add more routes, I would say, is manually. Otherwise, if you add some routes and then attempt to optimize again, it's going to overwrite everything again. So I hope that answers the question. With MXW's case or any other device that's not supported by Designer at this moment, you would still go to Dante Controller to do those additional manual routes.
Great. Okay, next question. Can I add other Shure wireless microphones? I don't see them on the list of the virtual devices.
Right, not at this moment. MXW, ULXD, other lines like that are not currently supported in Designer, but we're definitely thinking about it, and it's in the roadmap.
All right. Does Designer help with microphone versus speaker placement regarding minimizing feedback?
So it will basically just show what I showed you on the coverage map. It will show, let's see, let me add this MXN. In the MXN case, it's showing these 3 rings, which I know are the 3, 6, and 9 dB down points of the speaker. And then as well for the 710, you can see these lobes represented here. Of course, these are more like a gradient, and it doesn't just have a hard cutoff here in terms of what it picks up. But this is basically what you get currently. I would say if there's any additional like heat mapping type requests coming in, we'll definitely keep that in mind and are thinking about that as we add new devices to coverage map.
Great. Next question. Can the P300 be replaced by IntelliMix Room and audited by Systemon?
So Yeah, basically when you're choosing your room devices, you can choose to use P300 if that works better for you, or IntelliMix Room if you just want to run it on the same room PC as your soft codec, for example. And either of those devices are supported in both Designer and System On. So System On 4.2, which actually came out shortly after Designer 4.2, does support IntelliMix Room now, as well as the 710, the MXN, and the mute button.
Great. And then we have a comment from one of those very intelligent support people who says, we may want to mention the MXN5-C has a reference output and may be the better AEC reference for MXA mics. Okay. How does it represent Dante routes to and from third-party devices?
So the way this works is only receive channels basically know what they're receiving. So say you had a third-party Dante microphone routed to this P300, you would actually be able to see the same kind of green check mark that you see here when you create a route. And if you hover over that circle, actually, you're able to see the name of that channel that's coming in as well. So you would be able to see that. However, unfortunately, you can't see where it's going if it's going to a third-party device. So if this 710 is going to a third-party DSP, for example, you would have to go to Dante Controller to create those routes and to be able to see that. But from Designer itself, you can't see where the 710 is going in general. That's how it works for transmit channels versus receive channels.
Okay. Does Optimize in Designer also enable the P300 IntelliMix optimization mode?
Yes, it does. And you can see the full list again in this question mark here. But yes, it does. It will automatically select the mic optimization mode based on what mic you're using in this location.
Okay. How does a template differ from a location preset? Is it related to coverage and or specific settings in the P300?
Yeah, good question. So actually in this case, in 4.2, we are going more towards device presets. So we got a lot of feedback that location presets were a little confusing right now. So you can still save a location preset, which would basically is just a mass way of saving to preset slot 1 on all 3 of those devices within this room. But you can't actually manage them and like push and pull between design mode and live mode with those location presets anymore. Just because we got some feedback on the usability of it and opted to go towards device presets more.
Okay.
So actually, really where you can manage them the most is by double clicking into a device and being able to save, import, and export presets from each device.
Great. All right. Is the device commissioning time proportional to the amount of hardware on the network?
I would say that if you're familiar with the template workflow, that it gets more streamlined, and that if you're familiar with how to create copies of the template and then, for example, push one design to each room at once, that gets a little more streamlined. We are trying to definitely make it faster. So instead of just having device level workflows, we have more like these location or room level workflows. And eventually we want to make that even faster so that you could, for example, push a room design to many at once or something like this.
All right. Is this just for MX series devices, or can it also show and control other devices like Axient, ULXD, and SCM?
Yeah, so right now it's mainly focused around the MX portfolio or the MXA portfolio and newer devices. Currently, like I said, we don't support some of those wireless devices like Axient Digital, ULXD, MXW, but we're definitely thinking about it. And as requests come in, we'll definitely triage that based on how important that would be to users.
Okay.
And how common mixing up those kind of different systems is, out there in applications.
Great. How do you adjust the coverage of the MXA 310A or the MXA 910?
Good question. So let me open that up again. So the MXA 310 is not in the location coverage map at this moment. It's actually the only device with coverage that still relies on you basically clicking into that device. So I'm going to drop out of live mode just to more easily show this here. When you double click a 310, it'll look very similar to the MXA 310's browser interface, and that's where you configure coverage. Again, it's not in location coverage map right now, but again, definitely in consideration for future improvements of Designer. We're putting out software releases at least a couple times a year, hopefully more than that, and we're definitely keeping this feedback in mind for future releases.
Great.
For the MXA 910, I'm sorry, I didn't answer the 910 question.
Yeah.
The 910 can be adjusted both in the single device view and from the location coverage map. So you could actually go to either place to adjust the coverage.
Great. Speaking of coverage, is there a way to change the view for a wall mount MXA 10? Excuse me. Is there a way to change the view for a wall mount MXA 710 for elevation?
So let me show that really quick. So the only view, so it's a top-down view for most device installations for the 710, but if you switch to, let's see, wall vertical, that's where you can also get a side view, because as you can see, the top-down view is not so helpful for the wall vertical installation. Up here, there's a button called Open Side View, and you would be able to steer the lobe from this side view of the 710. But in general, there is actually not really a device height parameter for the 710, because what really matters is the rotation, basically, and the angle of these lobes. But there's actually no device height feature for any of the installations for the 710 specifically.
Great. Okay, how do you adjust the IP address of a Shure device in Designer?
Yeah, to do that, I'm going to go, well, let's see, to quickly get into that, I'll go back to online devices, because again, you can't adjust network settings from a virtual device. So I'll just open my online MXA 310. Go to the settings page up here in the top right with that gear icon, and then go to network. This is where those network settings are.
All right.
And you could adjust from here.
Awesome. Follow-up question on speaker versus mic placement. What is the target speaker dB down and mic dB down rings and spaces, etc.? Sort of like negative 20 FB between the two? Sorry, I probably butchered that question, but...
No problem. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to rely on either our support team. If anyone has any insight on that, definitely let me know.
Yeah, I think voice lift is definitely sort of a more complicated discussion topic. And we do have other, webinars and features that we've done about that. So if you go to Shure.com and search for voice lift, you should be able to find some supporting things. And then you can also open up a ticket if you've got a specific application that you're trying to work out with at Shure.com/contact. Okay. Can you export the designer file from devices if you are not the person who created the original file?
Okay, if I understand, you might be talking about the device preset files. If you are, yes, you can export that file, and the device knows about it. So if someone else saved that preset file, for example, in the browser interface or in their instance of Designer, you would be able to see that again when you open the device and go to that flag icon in the top right. So if someone else created this preset on the 710, I could still export it from my instance as well.
Great. The average latency of the input-output audio signal on the Dante network would be increased by a DSP delay? ?
I'm sorry, that's another one I don't know the answer to.
Awesome, no worries.
Yeah,
all right.
More of a...
Yeah, like I said, visit Shure.com/contact to fill out a ticket to be connected with our support team. They can definitely help you guide you through any sort of installation questions and help you kind of navigate all of those tricky questions and situations you might run into. All right, and I think with that just about wraps up all the questions. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you learned a little something, and we hope to see you on the next one. Take care, everyone.